Our final speaker today is Aike Rots from the University of Oslo, and we will be discussing crossing boundaries, rethinking the study of Japanese religion in the Asian Anthropocene. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you for inviting me. Many thanks to the Nanzan Institute for Religion and Culture, and many thanks to all of you who the last 2 days have been here, presented, and the discussions. It's been very intellectually stimulating, and I've learned so many things these past 2 days. And it's a great honor also to be the very last speaker. I'm happy so many of you are here, despite the fact that it's the afternoon. We've had a long day. I'll try my best, to keep you awake. But it's a great honor to be here as the last speaker, and I'll try a little bit to reflect on some of the things that have been said. And so my plan today is sort of trying to combine two things. One is I would like to share with you some of my recent and ongoing research on what we might call maritime popular religion in Japan and elsewhere in East Asia, and especially on rituals and more than human relationality in rituals. I'll explain that. And the other thing I would like to do is sort of in line with the overall theme of this symposium, to think a little bit about not so much the past. I mean, the title of the symposium is Japanese Journal of Religious Studies, Past, Present, and Future. We've had quite a lot of talks about the past, I think. We've had significantly less about the present and very little about the future. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to try to predict the future, but I will try to reflect upon things that are happening in the present. So maybe also try to sort of, paint a somewhat bigger picture, what I think are some of the challenges and some of the things that we should focus on within the bigger field of Japanese study of religion in Japan. And that is also what is sort of reflected in my title. If you're not familiar with the term Anthropocene, then don't worry, I'm explaining. Just very briefly, wanted to mention yesterday, also during the panel discussion, it was the question of what did the Japanese Journal of Religious Studies mean for people in their careers. For me personally, it's something very special because after I finished my PhD dissertation, I had a few publications, like book chapters and edited volumes. But my first peer-reviewed journal article in an international English language journal was in the Japanese Journal of Religious Studies. It was this article on the Shinto environmentalist paradigm and the rediscovery of Shinto no Mori. So in this article, I summarized some of my main findings and arguments from my PhD research, and then later I elaborated more on this in my monograph, which came out in 2017, Shinto Nature and Ideology in Contemporary Japan. So this is very special for me. It was very important, like for me personally, to get that article out, and it's actually today is one of my most cited publications. It's also, I'm very happy it was translated into Japanese. The project of Kokugakuin University had this project to translate English language articles into Japanese and the other way around. So it's also available in Japanese. And in this article, I discussed, some of you may have read it, or you may have read the abstract at least, but in this article, I discussed this concept of Shinto no Mori, so Shinto sacred shrine forests, and notions about Shinto as an ancient tradition of nature worship that has important solutions for environmental crisis today. And I showed how this is a very recent notion and how this has come to gain popularity. So, and some of my interests, I won't be talking about forests so much today, but some of my interest in religion in relation to natural environment, other than human actors, trees, animals, and so on, is also reflected in my current research. So just a few initial thoughts that I wanted to share with you that I had when preparing this talk, and also yesterday. The name is JJRS, but every now and then I get the impression that perhaps it should be more JSJR, Journal of the Study of Japanese Religion, rather than the Japanese Journal of Religious Studies. And what is in the name? Many of what also came up yesterday, some of the articles and special issues in the 1970s about secularization theory at the time. When I read these as a PhD student, like several decades later, these were already quite ahead of their time. These were some good discussions of, the pros and the cons of secularization theory and so on. And I think now, generally, the idea of JJRS, the image that people have of JJRS is this is the flagship journal of the study of religion in Japan, the study of Japanese religion. But what if something to consider? This was not just a flagship journal of the study of religion in Japan, but also a place, a venue. And this is just something I want to put out here for you to consider. But a venue, a place where people can apply Japanese perspectives to the transnational study of religion, actually giving this more of a transnational basis. And this came up a little bit in the discussions yesterday about, for example, using certain Japanese concepts that might be applicable also to the study of religion or other aspects of society, right? In other geographical contexts. So that's just a thought. Like, if we, with the name JJRS, there is a potential there that maybe would be something to reconsider. So as I mentioned, unlike most of you who are historians, I don't consider myself a historian. I'm a scholar of the present. It's a very difficult historical period to study, as some of you know. But of course, the past and the future are also there, always there, right? So I'm really going to try to talk as much as I can about the present. But when we're talking about the present, we're always talking about memories of the past. We're always talking about stories, narratives of the past that gain significance, that have meaning in the present. Okay. And then there's this difficult thing of future. And of the term of future, of course, it always is added to the title of events such as this one, because but at the same time, we're usually shy away from really talking about the future because it's difficult. We don't really know. But I think we should take the future very, very seriously, not as something that we can predict, but as something that people live with in the present, in their hopes, in their fears. We're always living towards the future, right? So there is this growing field of interdisciplinary research field that is like futurisms, like studies of how people conceptualize the future. And I think that especially in the current age, which is a time of crisis, we're living in an age of crisis, global ecological crisis, economic various crises, and of increasing precarity. And that's not only in the global south, it's especially in the global south. We also see that many wealthy societies in the global north, at the time of global inequality, we have to undergo many great transitions. And in a time such as this, the futures matter tremendously to people in the present. So we have to actually take those futures, those futurisms, seriously as research data in their own right. So this is just sort of as an initial thought about different kinds of temporalities that we're dealing with. When you're studying the present, you're always studying different ways that people relate to both the past and the future. My talk today has three overarching themes, and those are three themes that I think are very important, are emerging already now, very important research themes, the study of religion in Japan, but also more broadly, the study of religion internationally. And the first of these is related to this recurring question of the category religion, yeah? And of course, many of you have done great historical research on the genealogy of religion in Japan and how that concept has been used and reused and in some cases abused. And I think there's one truly powerful new societal category. And the category is not new per se, but a category that has acquired a lot of political significance globally, and that is the category of heritage. I would go as far as to say as that the category of heritage allows state actors, corporate actors, and religious institutional actors to reposition sacred sites and practices in the center of public space, to reclaim them in some ways, to move them away from the private realm of religion to something more public. And that can be as concrete as getting state funding for repairs. It can be related to tourism, getting more income, so it has a very clear economic aspects, but it also has to do with the kind of ideology that we were talking about, right? If you don't have, because of the constitution, if you can't do religion in schools, right? You can certainly do intangible cultural heritage in schools. When your rituals are heritage, it becomes a completely different matter, right? So that's one thing that this is a topic that hasn't really been mentioned. But it's really something I would encourage us all to think this is something we have to take very, very seriously when we study formations of religion and a category of religion. Heritage is right there, and it's a category of governance. And Japan, in some very key respects, has been quite ahead and developed some of these, not least the category of intangible heritage, which has now become successfully universalized through UNESCO lists. And countries like China, Korea, Vietnam have really jumped into this, like making this a way of creating new kinds of public sacred rituals. The second overarching theme that I'll be talking about actually the most today has to do with the importance of transnational similarities and, there should be a comma there, connections, similarities is twice. Okay, that should be one. For transnational connections, movements, and similarities. And this is an essay that I wrote a couple of years ago that will very soon come out as a journal article in the Copenhagen Journal of Asian Studies, in which I discuss the problem of what I see as methodological nationalism within Japanese studies. But I think it's broader. I think you also find this in other parts of, in other disciplines, especially Asian area studies. You find this in Chinese studies and Indian studies and so on. But I focus on Japanese studies because that's the field that I'm most familiar with. And by methodological nationalism, it's quite clearly to me, it's not the same as sort of ideological nationalism, political nationalism. It's implicit, taking a nation state for granted as a main category of analysis within scholarship. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of, just as Jolyon was talking about religion making, I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of studying Japan making practices, academic Japan making practices, how we as scholars have been not just complicit in creating and reifying religion as a category, but also in confirming Japan, reifying Japan as something set apart from China, Vietnam, Thailand, etc. Using a nation state as a main variable in analyzing certain practices that happen on the ground. I will say more about that in a minute. And the third theme that I will talk about, that is something that I believe is truly will affect many different fields of study, including study of religion, and that is what I call our current Anthropocene predicament. Now, the term Anthropocene, those of you who are not familiar with it, I assume most of you will have heard of it, but I'll just very briefly. It refers, it's a geological term, right? We had previous geological ages typically take very, very long, many thousands, tens of thousands of years. So we had previous age of Holocene and Pleistocene and Jurassic and so on, remember dinosaurs. Now, the geologists have agreed, it's taken them a couple of decades to agree on this, which is a very short period of time for geologists. They have by now agreed that we live in a new geological age. There is some disagreement about what to call it, but by and large, the consensus of agreement is we call this Anthropocene. Of course, anthropos referring to humans. And what characterizes this geological age is that the planetary environment, like everything on the planet, from the deepest oceans to the atmosphere, to our very cells, is affected by human activity. Like we all have microplastics in our bodies right now, and we don't really know what it does to us. There are no places on the planet that are not affected by human and modern industrial activity. So some scholars have argued for calling it capitalocene instead of Anthropocene, saying it's really capitalism. So we're not getting into semantics of it right now. But what matters to us is the emergence of a new rapidly growing interdisciplinary field of study that is called the environmental humanities. And environmental humanities brings together scholars working on literature, historians, anthropologists, philosophers, art historians, and as religious studies, we've been quite slow to really engage with environmental humanities. And meanwhile, environmental humanities hasn't really figured out what to do with religion yet. So this is something that on my current work, when I'm trying to do in my work, really trying to think of ways in which we can bring these two in a productive dialogue. So, and I do that in my current project, which is called Whales of Power, Aquatic Mammals, Devotional Practices, and Environmental Change in Maritime East Asia. So this is a project that's not only about Japan. It has a much larger comparative focus. It's centered around what I call Maritime East Asia, East, South China Sea, and regions around it. Doesn't mean it's a project with 5 people full-time, 3 PhD students, a postdoc, and myself. So it's still, in that sense, fairly small. So it doesn't mean it's not comprehensive that we look at all the regions. But we compare different practices in different parts of the region. This is funded by the European Research Council. It's a big grant that we got from the European Research Council. Started in 2019, and we'll have another year and a half or so. And so some of the examples that I give today they come from part of this project, things that we're looking at. This is just an example of something we've done recently. We've created a small exhibition at the university library about the project. This was a display case that I designed. This is about whale worship in Vietnam. And I'll be talking about whale worship in Vietnam a bit today. I realize most of you work in Japan, so you might not be that interested in hearing something about Vietnam, but I'll try to sort of squeeze in a little bit nonetheless, because I like to do that. But this is a display case about whale worship in Vietnam, where we had some text. We had a drawing and a statue of Wanam, whom you all know as Kamo. It's the same transnational bodhisattva, one of the most worshipped deities in the world, Kannon, and yet very few Buddhist scholars will actually write about Kannon as lived worship, right, rituals around. But in Vietnam, you see that whales are associated. People believe that whales, like living whales, they save people, and they're believed to be the helpers of Avalokiteshvara, of Kannon, or Wanam in Vietnamese. So we had several pictures, and so that's one of the examples, one of the things we did. But now, don't worry, we're going to Japan, or staying in Japan. This is one example of a place that I've been looking at, and that allows me to think concretely on the ground about such themes like the heritageization of religion, or religion in relation to heritage making, issues of the ritual and national identity, and not least environmental change and ecological loss. So Kaioi is an island in near sort of the northern part of not too far from Shimonoseki. If you go up there, Nagato, then you have the island of Kaioi. And this was, in the Edo period, this was a whaling region, yeah, because of the way the island is located. The current that many of the whales came with passed by quite close to the island, so people could engage in coastal whaling, like with spares. Like some other places where that happened was Taiji is very famous, and Wakayama Prefecture, Western Kyushu as well, Yobuko, and near what's now Saga Prefecture, Nagasaki Prefecture. So there were a couple of places in Japan where people engaged in seasonal coastal whaling during the Edo period. It was certainly not widespread throughout the peninsula. It was quite located, but in a recent book, Jacobina Arch, environmental historian, she's demonstrated that even though it was quite, only a few places where this happened, it really did significantly impact Edo period economy. Not so much the meat, that wasn't very sensitive because you couldn't keep it for very long, but the oil and the blubber, that sort of other whale products, the lean as well, other whale products that were significant, for example, making pesticides and so on during the Edo period for agriculture. Now, so Kaioi was quite an important center of whaling during the Edo period. Whaling was discontinued here about 1 century ago. In the late 19th century, like whale populations gradually declined. This has long been attributed to American whaling in the seas there. But this was also the period that Japan made the transition from small-scale coastal whaling to modern industrial, like harpoon whaling, which led to global depletion of whale populations globally. Now, the picture, what you see on the picture is important prefectural heritage site This is a tomb. You can see the Nama Midabutsu on it, Pure Land tombstone for the spirits of whale fetuses. People here believed that they were not actually allowed to kill pregnant whales. And there are these local stories about Kannon, who is here as the name of Gyore Kannon, not Gyorang Kannon. It's one of the 33 manifestations of Kannon, but Gyore is fish spirit Kannon. If anyone of you, by the way, has references to texts that discuss Gyore Kannon, please let me know, because I'd like to learn more about it. So there are these references to the fish spirit Kannon, Gyore Kannon, who appear to people in dreams and who would tell them not to catch whales that were pregnant. And of course, one way to interpret this is a type of pre-modern sustainability, right? These kind of taboos that would help people, because you want the populations to remain stable. So it's not a good idea to capture those with cubs. There's just one problem here. From the outside, you can't really tell. Whales are pretty big and it's empty the water, right? So it happened nonetheless, right? People would catch those whales, and out of fear for divine retribution or out of guilt, we don't really know, right? The motivations that people had. So whales were given, anyway, here whales were given kaimyo, that were given posthumous names. They're listed at a Buddhist temple. They have their own, the ihai and so on. But here also then, there was a special tomb and rituals that were conducted for the spirits of those whale fetuses. Next to this tomb is the statue of Jizo-sama. And what's interesting now is that even though whaling was discontinued here over a century ago, it's still very much part of local identity, and it's also been used as a way to attract tourists. Even there's a small whaling museum. It's a beautiful island with the natural environment as well worth a visit. It's a fishing town, but fewer and fewer families engage in fishing, partly because there's so little fish in the sea. This is the kind of ecological loss that I'm talking about. Like, people have to adapt and change their livelihoods, partly because the abundance of non-human others that they depend on and that for their livelihood, for their living, just gradually disappears. And this happened with whales in the late 19th century, and today it's happened with many other fish and seafood species, right? So people here in the village have to find other ways of livelihood. Now, one thing that is often experimented with, not always as successful in all places, is tourism. So what you see here, this is a whaling reenactment festival, Kujira Matsuri, that was created in the early Heisei period, 1991, I think is when it started. And they have this giant artificial whale that then during the festival goes out into the water, and young men, by now also they have to get volunteers from other parts of the country because there are not enough young men living in the village anymore. But young men, they go out on these boats, and they look quite handsome, I have to say, and they go over the snare, they kill the whale, and then afterwards, the other part of the heritage here that is officially listed are the whaling songs. So what happens afterwards is they bring the whale on land, they take out a tremendously cute stuffed little baby whale, and they put the baby whale, it's all very performative, very playful. And at the same time, it's very much part of, it's quite serious in its performance, in its playfulness in a way. It's put in front of not the actual tombstone, but a copy, a sort of artificial copy of it that looks exactly the same. And then they put the baby whale there and they sing the song. So this one example of a case where you see things coming together, like whaling. Here's the identity politics. They received support for this festival and for the museum from the Institute of Cetacean Research. Like, whaling lobby has been involved in this. There's the local issues of people no longer making a living fishing, etc. But then also historically, the very real concerns about the spirits of the people that they had killed and the well-being, the ritual care that comes with it. Second place I wanted to take you with is in a very different part of the country, in Miyagi Prefecture near Kisennuma, so close to Iwate, where there's a peninsula, Karakwa Peninsula, and a shrine. Here you see Ebisu. Ebisu is what today is mostly like a associated with great catch for companies, like a lot of wealth and profit. But of course, historically, it's a god associated with fishing, but it was also in many places associated with whales. The whales were believed to be Nellie Naumann, who's a classical article in the 1970s, where she discusses this. Whales were, in many places in Japan, were seen actually as the physical embodiment or the manifestation of a beast. In some places, whales would occasionally beach when they got lost, and then people would consider this like a divine gift, a gift from Ibisu, because one whale, they're big, they can keep a village, especially during times of hardship and so on. They can generate significant income for a fishing village, right? And this explains why many places along the coast, throughout Japan, we see whale graves and whale tombs. And very often you see references to Ibisu and statues of Ibisu. So this one is part of Osaki Jinja, which is a shrine at Karakura Peninsula. What's interesting about this particular shrine is that there is a local legend that the founders of the village came in the early 14th century, came from Kyushu, got into a storm, and then were brought by a white whale, guided there by a white whale. So the whale here, whales are the messengers of the local Ujigami. And there are also other stories that came later, fishers went fishing and who got into the storm who were also saved by whales. And there are several whales that came ashore, and there's several also tombs for the whales. This is one of the places in Japan where people would say where they didn't ever eat whale meat, okay? So they wouldn't want to consume the meat of whale exactly because it was a sacred animal. Now, this is remarkably similar to whale worship in Vietnam. The story of the whale saving the fishers, the whale coming, bringing the leader of the community in safety through the storm, and not least whales who die on the beach, who are then giving a grave or given the ritual funeral, and people actually refraining from eating them. This is the kind of history that's not part of all the official narratives about Japan being a traditional whaling nation, right? But it's very much part of that historical diversity. And again, this is a place that we can think about as ritual traditions. These ritual traditions are not just a way of humans, sort of Durkheimian sense, creating community. They're not just a way of humans of communicating with the divine. They're ways of communicating, of mediating relationships between humans and the natural environment and other beings, be they the beings animals that they depend upon for their livelihood, for example, the sea, the weather, etc. So these were some of the places that I've been looking at in my research. A couple of others, but it's in Vietnam. So what does this say about Japanese religion? Now I'd like to zoom out a little, giving you some case studies and some examples. I was interested yesterday, and it sort of confirmed the impression I had before, that we've now been scrutinizing and many excellent studies. Orion had them on, you have them all on your slide with the pictures there, of the historical formation of Shukyo. And that's been really important, that we've been doing that kind of. But what about the adjective Japanese in Japanese religion? Or what about the Nihon in Nihon Shukyo? That hasn't received remotely as much attention within, and I'm talking not just like, of course, there are historical studies of like the construction of the modern nation state, Vietnam, Japan, sorry, Tesla Suzuki, Time Space Nation is an example, the work of Carol Gluck. So there is good scholarship, and then in post-war period, Harumi Befu and Nihonjiro and so on. So there is that good scholarship on constructions of Japaneseness. But what about the adjective Japanese within the compound Japanese religion, or within the compound Japanese philosophy or Japanese literature, etc.? And that's something I'm interested in, how we are creating our objective study, so to speak. Now, and I'm particularly interested in this notion of Japanese religion as a system, because I don't think it is a system, but I see that the idea about the system of Japanese religion was a way of getting out of the denominational diversity kind of thing, that we have Buddhism, we have Shinto, we have the new religions. So I see why scholars like Earhart and Kitagawa and Ian Reader and so on, I see when they made that move and said no, and of course many Japanese scholars, maybe it goes back even to Anesaku Masaharu, the latest, certainly post-war period, Umehara Takeshi is somebody that I've studied. This whole idea that we have Kamata Toji, etc., that we have one system, Japanese religion, with some defining characteristics like an underlying substratum, and then you have the diversity and unity. An example is Reader and Tanaka 1998, which in many ways is an excellent study. It's some very important work in getting the focus away from the discursive studies to the more look at what people are doing on the ground, the practices. So that was very important. But they define Genzo Yaku as the religious system of Japan. And now, if you've ever been to places like Bangkok or Taipei or Hanoi, as you looked at the popular ritual practices there, you see, probably all sorts of religious activity, ritual activity throughout the world. A focus on what happens in this world is perfectly normal. It's really human. It's what we all do. There's nothing uniquely Japanese about this. So why use the nation state as your defining variable? This is something I'm really, really I've been puzzling about. And this is what I call academic Japan making, methodological nationalism. So I would like actually to invite us all to think about what makes the things, when do we need Japan as a core category? And when do we actually look at how we ourselves or colleagues or earlier scholars have been involved in processes of Japan making? Okay? And especially because when you create this system, you're missing out on certain things. Things get excluded inevitably. And those things then are not part of what we call Japanese religion. Now, one thing that's been very obvious to me in the case of the Ryukyu Islands, but certainly, especially in the case of Ainu tradition, is that we have two indigenous minority cultures that became part of Japan in the modern period through colonialism, that still are part of what is today the nation state Japan, that have very different religious traditions. And that's not something that as a field of Japanese religious studies we typically engage with. It's something we typically shy away from. There have been some articles in JJRS, for example, about Okinawan religion, but few and far between. And when we did the new Nanzan guide, and I edited that section, was involved or co-edited that particular section on space and environment. We were looking for somebody to write a chapter on Ainu religion. We couldn't find anyone who could do that. Right? So this tells you something. Migrant religions, another key part of religiosity in Japan today. Just 2 days ago, I was curious if there was a Vietnamese Buddhist temple in the Nagoya region. Yes, there is, and indeed there are dozens already of Vietnamese Buddhist temples, many in Hyogo, many in the Kanto area. This is growing really fast, right? It's very much part of what religion in Japan is today. It's the things that Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean, Filipino migrants who live in Japan who are part of this society, what they are doing as well. That's another thing. And then the third here is my interest in common patterns throughout East and Southeast Asia. And I'm not saying that, there have been many great case studies of particular temple complexes in Japan, for example. I'm not saying that everybody who's done that kind of scholarship is guilty of methodological nationalism. That's not my point. My point is that there are particular tacit assumptions of what constitutes our object of study and other things that fall out of it, right? And one of the consequences of this is that we might think that things we observe in Japan are something, special about Japan. A typical example, I don't think so many academics would still subscribe to this, but it's out there and like in the internet, and it's very common and popular descriptions of Shinto is the idea that Shinto kami somehow cannot be translated as gods because they're unique, because they're so different from whatever the Christian God. So, have you ever traveled around Asia? I mean, there's kami everywhere. In fact, the concept kami, the character, that's a Chinese character, shun. It's very easily translatable in a Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese context. The Vietnamese word for local god is Ton. How do you write that? With the exact same character as Kami. So I mean, it should be a no-brainer, right? But this is just one example of ways in which category, sort of academic category boundaries, like the formation of a subfield, sometimes prevents us to see similarities in other places. So the question then is, when we have these institutional structures, like a journal, like academic institutes, and we want to preserve these because we want to keep some of those jobs, and we think it's an important field of study. But how can we, within these established structures, how can we sometimes question and break down some of these classifications, right? Or rethink them? So this is an invitation for all of us to think about those. So what I suggest in this forthcoming article is there are three things that we can do in order to overcome this methodological nationalism. One is to study processes of Japan making, like how academics and state actors and heritage, NGOs, etc., have created Japan. So think of Japan as an ime category, quite similar to the religion making that Jolyon was talking about. The second is this awareness, studying more diversity within the Japanese Isles, including indigenous minority religions that are like historically in pre-modern times were not part of the Japanese, proto-Japanese state, as well as transnational connections. And then in relation to that, my third suggestion is to develop an intra-Asian comparative perspective. And I'll say just a few more words about that. Now, there has been within both religious studies and anthropology, quite understandably, the last 20, 30 years or so, people have pushed back against comparison. And within religious studies, this is very understandable because comparative religion was often associated with universalist, ahistorical Eliadian approaches. Right? Within anthropology, it has more to do with the colonial history of that discipline. That people are like, okay, you have to move away from comparative projects because they're universalizing and they deny diversity. But recently, more and more scholars have pointed out that has led to a particular fragmentation of knowledge that we've thrown out the child with the bathwater, so to speak. So there's been a move back towards intra-Asian comparison, not in a sort of generalizing universalist kind of way, but focusing on particulars. And two scholars in particular that I'd like to mention are Peter van der Veer, who's done most of his work on the sort of historical anthropology of practices in China and India, and Laurel Kendall, who, of course, some of you know as a scholar, has long focused on Korean shamanism, but recently has started doing research in Vietnam and Myanmar and Bali and other places. This is her recent. So this is a development that I very much sympathize with and hope to contribute. And I think especially within an East Asian sort of Sinitic sphere of influence, this is in some ways fairly easy because countries like Vietnam, Korea, and China and Japan, they have a shared ritual cosmological world. They have shared understandings of the diversity of, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and the deities, the importance of ritual care for dad spirits so they don't get you in trouble. This is a very common pan-Sinitic thing. And so I think this comparative approach should not only be applied to pre-modern traditions, but also very much to modern and contemporary things. I think this is something you can do both historically, but you can also do it in contemporary work. And so when I, in my work, try to compare things taking place in Japan and Vietnam, I'm not comparing them as Japanese or as Vietnamese. These are places that I study, but then one of the things that I can study is how ritual practices, for example, festival traditions, that at one moment in time are seen as local, peripheral, backward, or even superstitious, become national heritage, right? Take on new significance. So this is one of the things I'm looking at in my current project, and it will come up with one of the themes in my forthcoming book. So then comparing particulars can be a way of gaining new insights into a larger whole. That's also what Peter van der Veer is saying. Now, to just give some examples, here you see this maritime sinosphere that I was talking about. I often use this map because it nicely recenters the periphery. Quite literally, here is Okinawa at the center. and it helps us to think of this region as a connected, historically connected maritime region. We are here, not here, sorry. And of course, there throughout both pre-modern and modern history, but especially in early modern, before we had airplanes and so on, there were so many maritime connections in this region. So this is sort of where I locate my research, more or less, around the seas. And one clear example, I think, there are other goddesses. Mazu versus is another good example. One very obvious example of a goddess whom I really think has been significantly understudied is Guanyin. And especially popular devotion to Guanyin in relation to multi-species, non-human animals, in relation to the sea, in relation to precarity of life as well, right? So the fluidity of things, and people worshiping her past, present, and probably future. This is a picture that this was a statue that we found in a shrine near Yokogo. So a Kannon-sama near a shrine. It's also early Heisei period. It's not really that old. It's donated by a fishing boat. And it says Iruka Kuyo, with the Chinese characters for Iruka. So this was probably donated in relation to a Kuyo ritual that was conducted for dolphins that either they had caught deliberately or accidentally, that I don't know. But it's an example of, and there are all these rituals. Kannon doesn't just only care about humans. She cares about non-human others as well. She takes care of the spirits of animals. And she does so throughout that maritime sinosphere. So this is Mẹ Nam Hai, the mother of the South Sea. That's another name that in Vietnam they gave to Guanyin, Kannon, where she carries the whale in her hand. This is from Bac Lieu in the Mekong Delta in the south of Vietnam. And Kannon is worshipped throughout Vietnam and of course China and Korea as well. And so in Vietnam, as I said, she's related to whale worship. I won't talk too much about it now, but I'm very happy to answer questions about it because it's very much on my mind. You see some pictures of, this is quite a large whale skeleton that they put out mostly for tourists to see in Phan Thiet. This is a smaller whale shrine near Hoi An in central Vietnam. And there is the association, and you see the character, of course, for Thun, which is a god. And there is the association with the fish. They refer to fish as Lord Fish, or the Lord of the South Sea. As I said, associated with Kannon, there are historians pointing out this was originally a Cham deity, a non-Vietnamese deity, was incorporated into the early modern Vietnamese Nguyen pantheon. Again, if you're interested in the history of this, we can talk more about this later. But here, what I want to point out, in the foundational mythology of the Nguyen dynasty, beginning of the 19th century, King Yalom, who was the first there, he had a shipwreck. He nearly drowned, but he was saved by a whale, and that whale was the Cham deity, non-Vietnamese, was then incorporated into the modern pantheon. It's the same story almost, very similar story. I'm not talking about shared origins here. I'm talking about very interesting similarities that we're thinking about. As what we saw in Karakwa, Osaka Jincha. Coincidence, maybe, but worth thinking about. So as I said, also today, people believe this is a life-saving god. I've met many people who are still alive today because they were saved by whales. And as I said, mostly in central and southern Vietnam, so not so much. This is not new. I'm not inventing the wheel here. There's some very interesting work that's been done recently. This came up yesterday in the discussion. This edited volume, Yoshida Kashiko, I think that was trying to do some of this, as you were saying, Paul Swanson. I think you're also referring to this book yesterday. Trying what happens if we can apply this Japanese concept and we look at what happened in other parts of Asia. So that's the kind of comparative research that I think is very promising. Increasing interest in maritime religions away from the land, which this edited volume of Fabio Lambelli and contributors there, which also in a way it breaks down some of the principles of the modern nation state, right? The moment you move towards the sea, it already gets more blurred. And in JJRS, this article recently came out, but Shintoization of Mazu. So those I think are all examples of the kind of transnational comparative approach that I think we need more of. So one last point, then I'll finish, is what I mentioned about the Anthropocene and about environmental humanities. And I've sort of hinted at this a couple of times, but I'd like to say a few more words about this. So as I said, Anthropocene is a concept that's now become very common in scholarship, both historical and anthropological, and also like political science, different disciplines writing about environmental issues. It was related specifically to Asian studies in 2014, special issue of the Journal of Asian Studies. Mark Hudson had an article in there where he discussed the concept and where he argued that this is especially important in relation to Asia, and also like why we as Asian studies scholars have to take this seriously, not only because the Anthropocene, climate change, biodiversity loss affects people in Asia, so we have to just understand and study how people relate to this and cope with this, but also because there might be certain types of knowledge within Asia that, if not help us solve the crisis, but at least help us maybe understand certain ways or alternative ways of conceptualizing it, for example, and of finding ways of relating to it. There was another article by Karen Thornburg, who was also written, a scholar of literature, who's also written a lot about conceptions of nature and the environment in Asian literature. So what are some of the ways that working on religion in and beyond Japan, that's environmental humanities, and we can think about the Anthropocene, we can contribute to? The first that comes to mind is environmental history. And I say this because I know many of you are historians and you do excellent work on the history of Japanese religion. There's also environmental history within Japanese studies. It's like really fast growing field. Some really interesting work has been done. I already mentioned Jacobina Arch. Of course, Conrad Topman, the Green Archipelago was first, but recently there's several very interesting studies. Now, what about these religious institutional responses? If we start reading those, say, medieval or early modern texts, in relation to weather events, in relation to climate change, it's already happening in the viruses and so on, but even more so, like really through the lens of environmental change. I think there's great potential here for coming to new understandings, but also toxicity, right? In modern times, you think about Minamata, think about places like Yokkaichi, where I've just been, Fukushima, of course, in relation to religious responses and so on. So there's already some things happening, I think, but much more. I think that should be a central key concern. I already mentioned literature, the work of Karen Thornburg, and then multi-species approaches. Barbara Ambrose, in the field of Japanese religion, has done interesting work about ways of relating to non-human animals in ritual. I also think this is like a field that there's much potential there. And not just taking animals seriously as symbols, because of course this has been done for a long time, but taking them seriously as historical actors who have been involved in shaping what human culture and human religion, what humans have done, right? I mean, what happens when whales stop coming or fish no longer appear in the sea and people have to change their livelihood, and then as a result, Ebisu shrines have to redefine what Ebisu is and what he does. This is just one example of thinking animal agency in the transformations of a god. But also very important, corporate structures. I sometimes get asked the question, because I've written about Shinto responses to the natural environment, why don't they do more? It's like, well, Shinto shrines, they depend on corporations. Those are their main sponsors, right? They depend on many of them at least, depend on the economic, political status quo that we have today. And of course, Japan is an extractivist capitalist economy as it is today. And it's not in their interest to change this. So the environmentalism that you see, with few exceptions, but most Shinto environmentalism is aesthetic, performative environmentalism, but it's not about changing the system, because it's essentially a corporate religion. And many of these companies, they're dependent on fossil fuel extractivism. So those are topics we have to take seriously when we study religion. So this is what I'm trying to do, is sort of moving away from the idea that religion can be a solution to these problems, which I haven't really seen so much empirical evidence of, but rather thinking more of how people use rituals in order to mediate their relationships with a scary, unpredictable natural environment around. But these are just some suggestions. I'm sure others can come up with other things. My point is just putting the natural environment much more in the center of the study of Japanese. Basically, what I'm arguing. So, just to conclude, things that we might want to take more seriously or that we are already in some ways taking seriously in the present, and we might take seriously in the future. Again, I haven't talked so much about it today, but the importance of, in relation to the category religion, the growing importance of heritage as a category of governance. I really think that's something to consider. I'm really would like to see, and I'm trying to do some of this myself also, but encouraging it among my students, looking at different religious practices taking place in Japan that are not necessarily part of the reified Japanese religion. And that includes primarily indigenous religious traditions and migrant minority religions. And then, as I said, thinking of the Japanese Isles not as a sort of self-contained unit with unity and diversity, but as part of a much larger maritime sinosphere, both historically and today. And then also it means that sometimes we'd have to do that comparative research, and that can be collaborative, right? Because I sometimes get people, what about language? Yeah, took me a long time to learn Japanese. I don't have time to learn Chinese in addition, although some people really, they do both and chapeau, but there's nothing wrong with doing that kind of collaborative research, also with colleagues working in different parts of Asia. These kind of things that we're talking about, the Shimbutsu relations, different parts across Asia, and then, as I said, study of religion in the Anthropocene as a lived reality. Think of ritual as mediation with powerful non-human actors. So if you're thinking special issues, Matt, I can't do all three of them, but I'm happy to be involved at some point. Just some ideas of, directions where we as a field might go. But really the Anthropocene and the different crises that we as humans and as non-humans are dealing with today, I think is something that we really have to put center stage. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.